5 years since the people of Yemen stood together to demand change. Almost 1 year since the start of a civil war. Can the dream of revolution be salvaged? And what will it take for Yemenis and their many foreign backers to make peace? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. Remember Yemen? It can be hard sometimes, given the way especially Syria, its 5-year war and the resulting refugee crisis grabs the headlines and demands our attention. But we shouldn't forget the struggle in Yemen. A failed revolution, a rebel takeover which drew major regional powers into a war, and a humanitarian crisis. And all of this in what was already the Middle East's most impoverished country. So in this program, we're throwing the spotlight back on Yemen and its open-ended crisis. This is where it all began, the capital, Sana'a, in 2011. Thousands of Yemenis demanding the resignation of their long-time ruler, Ali Abdullah Saleh. They hoped it'd be a fast beginning to a new era. But now many Yemenis say their revolution was hijacked by foreign powers and brought more poverty and conflict. Saleh was eventually forced out, but 3 years later, Iranian-backed rebels known as the Houthis swept down from their northern strongholds and seized the capital. The fierce fighting that followed pushed the new president, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi, into exile and gave the Houthis new territory. So, Saudi Arabia began a bombing campaign to drive out the Houthis. That started a year ago. But the human impact has been devastating, and naval embargoes caused severe food, water and medicine shortages in a country dependent on imports. Which brings us up to today. Look at this. This is Aden, the southern port city. Once a thriving area for trade, now pretty much in ruins. So let's bring in our guests for today. In London, we've got Baraa Shiban, who's a human rights activist. He was a member of Yemen's national dialogue process. And also joining us from Dubai via Skype, Adam Barron. He's a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Do appreciate it today. Let's start with you, Baraa Shiban, in London. After watching what happened in, say, Tunisia and Egypt, did you feel back then, 5 years ago, that a revolution would come easily in Yemen, that the dominoes would fall as they had elsewhere?
Absolutely, I would say absolutely not, actually.
Oh, okay.
The year before the revolution, it was a very frustrating year. It was a very tense year. The political situation was, let's say, not going in the right direction. But as the protests started in Egypt specifically, people in Yemen started to watch that very closely, and I think that's when the former president Saleh started to really worry that something similar might happen in Yemen. I still remember that day that he rushed to the parliament. He quickly removed an amendment process that would give him the ability to run for another elections. And the night Mubarak fell down, I remember going out to the streets, and we meet hundreds of other youth protesters in front of Sana'a University, and all of them were demanding for the same thing. Everyone was feeling that huge desire that this is the right time for change. Everyone was seeing actually how people were celebrating in Cairo, in Egypt, in Tunisia, and definitely people were saying that a similar thing can happen in Yemen.
But it didn't, did it? And that's the problem. That's why we're talking today. And this is such a broad question to us, but what went wrong with Yemen's revolution? Not to say that Egypt, for example, or Libya were great successes in the end, because they weren't. But at the time they were successes, and we all sat back and thought, my gosh, Mubarak's gone, Gaddafi's gone. Didn't happen for Yemen.
I think there are many elements that led to the current situation in Yemen. First of all, I think there was an underestimation of the counter-revolution and how willing actually the former president is willing to go over the edge to push the country actually into a civil war. Right now, we're seeing everyone, almost each city now is affected by the civil war in Yemen. But at the deep cause of that civil war is the former President Saleh and the military units loyal to him. I think no one imagined that he's willing to push the situation over the edge, and the alliance that was created between him and the Houthi rebels. There are many elements, of course, into that. There is, of course, the incompetency of the transitional period. There was the many challenges facing the transitional process. But let me say this: the revolution is a generational change, and I think that generation, the change, have already reached the generation of the 11th of February in Yemen. And I think for no matter how long it's going to take, I think that generation is still there, and they are still willing for that change to happen.
You use that phrase transitional period, so let's talk about that with Adam Baraa now in Dubai. Again, maybe this is the difference with Yemen. You had President Ali Abdullah Saleh at the time, who stepped down, but I mean, he really needed to be forced. It wasn't like, and again, I'm using these other examples, it wasn't like Egypt where Mubarak left, or it wasn't like Libya where Gaddafi was killed in the end. This was a sort of a weird transitional process to his deputy, which it wasn't clean, was it? And as such, Ali Abdullah Saleh could always remain there.
Well, I mean, at the time it was hailed as a model for the region, a triumph of diplomacy. But I think the flaws in what was then referred to as the Yemen model were quite clear to many of us, I'll put it that way, from the start. So effectively, this plan plotted out a transitional period where you would have a cabinet that was split between members of Saleh's party and members of what is referred to as the joint meeting parties, which was a coalition of opposition, establishment opposition parties from Yemen. So that means you have a cabinet that's composed entirely of old faces, whether they're against Saleh, whether they're for Saleh. These are all sort of old historical politicians, to put it one way.
So why did we look at it? Sorry, I'll interrupt you. Why did we look at it at the time as this great model, this thing that was a model for the rest of the Arab world? Because really, if a guy needs that much pushing to go, it means he doesn't really want to. And it's not going to be that clean, orderly transition.
Well, I mean, it was seen as a way of averting further bloodshed. And I guess, in a way, it did avert further bloodshed at the time. But then, I mean, as you've seen, looking over the past 4 or 5 years, it almost appears as if someone pressed the pause button on a VCR, and then about a year ago, they pressed play, or rather fast forward. So at the time, it appeared as if you had it appeared as if it was averting bloodshed. In reality, all it did was push back the conflict. The metaphor we often use is kick the can down the road, so that the real conflict started about, as you can say, 2 years ago, you can say a year ago, you can say 2.5 years ago. But either way, depending on whether you want to put wherever you put the ruler, it effectively failed to resolve the conflict and instead postponed it. 1. 2, it set in place the formation of what you can only really refer to as an incompetent transitional authority, one that was split between people who had been fighting a war for the past nearly a year at that point. When you look at the demands of protesters, the demands of people who went at the street, and you kind of strip down a lot of the politics, and you strip down a lot of sort of the more romantic aspects about it, what a lot of Yemenis came to demand, among other things, was a government that worked. They wanted a state that was functional and accountable to the people. And what you saw over the transitional period was something that was anything but that. The economy continued to grow worse. You saw signs of authoritarianism from a number of different political actors. So really, you had this situation that was ripe for various parties to take advantage of. And those two parties were the former president and former President Saleh and the Houthis, who jumped in and sort of, I guess, hijacked popular discontent and set off a series of events that have led us to
where we are now. Yeah. Adam and Baraa, I'm pleased to say we've got a third guest joining us, actually, from Washington, D.C. I just want to introduce Mohammed Al-Shami, who's a Yemeni civil society activist, among other things. Nice to have you with us, Mohammed. We've been talking about, I guess, what got us to this point, and you might have heard there what Adam was saying, and the fact that President or former President Ali Abdullah Saleh never quite left, did he? The next sort of major issue or thing which happened was the fact that he joined up with the Houthis. Did anyone really ever see that coming? Was that, I mean, united by a dislike of Saudi Arabia, sure, but it still was pretty odd the way it happened.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me. Second, I think it wasn't that far from predicting that would happen. To an extent, like Saleh, during all his time, he was always trying to more of utilizing the groups that he have against each other. So if you're looking back even at the wars in Saada, it wasn't like the front line who been facing or fighting Houthis. Rather than that, he was utilizing other groups to do the fight for them. The same thing happened in 1994 and other techniques that or other stages of his presidency that he used, always to utilize group against each other. From two perspectives that I would believe Houthis would go with Saleh. First of all, he just gave them powers they would never expect to have before and after. I mean, we can see like before coming to Sana'a, they were having struggle even in fights, even through inside Saada or like in Amran. Out of sudden they have brigades in hands, they have weapons that they could never imagine they would use. There is lots of factors that help them to go with that kind of alliances. Although we still can see it's alliances of convenience because they still not agree in many things. But also, I think they were more of like a survivor kind of bonding between both of them.
It's fascinating the way you all talk about it, gentlemen, all three of you. It's the Yemen which Baraa described to me at the start of the show sounds so different to the Yemen that Mohammed is now describing to me now. I mean, they're basically two different countries. But if I come back to you on the issue of, I guess, this new Yemen, the fact that about a year ago, Saudi Arabia got involved and it led this coalition in. I mean, it would never have been drawn into this extent if it weren't for the Houthis, would it?
Absolutely. I think it's both things. What Adam pointed out very clearly, which is the immunity deal that gave Saleh an immunity and allowed him to stay inside the country during the transitional period, despite many warnings that Saleh would spoil the transition, and he was just waiting for the right time to do it. And at a certain time, the Houthis came, and they felt that it was very convenient for them to have that power all out of a sudden. So I would say I would point both of them, the Saleh and the Houthis, would take the huge responsibility of where we are today. But again, I think, as Adam said, this is a conflict that just got postponed since 2011. Everyone expected that the conflict was struck in 2011, but actually what happened, it was just delayed. And eventually, Saleh spoiled the transition, as many of us actually expected.
Adam, is it even a conflict about Yemen anymore? You've got the Houthis, who ostensibly represent Iran. The Saudis are in there. There's foreign backers on both sides. I wonder if anyone even cares about Yemen anymore. Now, that's a really harsh thing to say, but everyone's looking out for their own interests.
No, I think fundamentally this remains a locally rooted battle for power. This is a turf war. Regardless of the regional political and sectarian dimensions, this is at its essence a series of interlocking, interconnecting political battles in Yemen. Of course, certain factions have looked outside for help. They've looked outside for alliances and things like that, and certain regions and certain countries in the region have also gotten involved as well. That being said, I think at its essence, even if the regional involvement has complicated things, we're looking at a locally rooted turf war.
Even though, as I pointed out, I'll stay with you, Adam, that Saudi Arabia probably wouldn't have gotten involved. In Saudi Arabia, the way we seem to view it is that it is in a proxy battle with Iran. It didn't like the idea of the Houthis being on their doorstep and the Houthis representing an Iranian-backed faction, so they got involved. I mean, to me, it really, I take into account everything you've just said, but to me, it really does feel like a bigger regional conflict.
I mean, it's not as if Saudi Arabia suddenly got involved a year ago. Saudi Arabia has been deeply involved in Yemen's politics for half a century at this point. So in some sense, I think this is, I mean, it's an evolution of the Yemeni-Saudi relationship in some form. And I think this was, when you see the intervention, you see the way Saudi intervened, absolutely this was partially owing to fear of Iran. But at the same time, this also had a lot to do with anxiety over Yemen's potential collapse, two, over a series of military moves made by the Houthis and their allies within the Yemeni military that were seen as demonstrating that Yemen could potentially launch attacks on Saudi Arabia. So it's, even if we're often looking at this through this regional sectarian lens, I think at its essence, this is a conflict rooted in the political. Okay. I mean, if you can go down to it, this is a series of almost brother against brother conflicts. You look at, the rivalry that has really shaped Yemen, for better or for worse, for the past 5 years, between Ali Abdullah Saleh and his cousin Ali Mohsen, who was the strongman, Saleh's right hand for 33 years, turned adversary in 2011. And in many ways, I would say the war we're seeing in Yemen is as much about Ali Abdullah Saleh versus Ali Mohsen as it is about Saudi Arabia versus Iran. And to some extent, I would say it's much more that than it is a regional battle for power. Of course, just simplified.
Okay, no, I just want to, I want to pause because I don't want us to run out of time, and I do want us to think about the human cost of the war in Yemen, because this is the thing which gets forgotten, I feel. Just want to run some numbers for our viewers here. The UN says nearly 6,000 people have been killed since March last year. So this is, the year of big conflict, if you like. A staggering 21 million people, more than 80% of the population, are in need of humanitarian assistance, many of them on the brink of famine. And it is especially tough, as it always is, on the children. The UN saying 10 million are in desperate need. Many have no access to food or clean water. And an average of 8 children are being killed or injured in this conflict every day. Mohammed Al-Shami, this is the real tragedy, isn't it? That this sort of stuff goes under the radar. There is another big conflict going on in Syria, which is important, obviously, but it overshadows perhaps what happens in Yemen.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and just added to that, one of the major issues is, even before that conflict, Yemen was already in crisis. Like, the economy was collapsing since 1990, and there was no capacity building for the government even to absorb the fund that was supposed to be going into the development on the country. Not to mention, starting with the Arab Spring, going all the conflict in Syria. That was so much affecting from the perspective of the kind of stakeholder and the kind of more neglecting, I would say, unfortunately, of the Yemeni crisis when it comes comparing to the Syrian one.
So how does the Yemen crisis, or how do the people in Yemen make themselves heard? I have heard that many different aid groups who do an amazing job there, and they speak and they say this is the forgotten crisis. There is a massive humanitarian crisis going on behind the bombing that we see every day, and yet it still doesn't elevate itself to a point where a difference is made, I feel.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think if you compare the effort with the resources they've been doing incredible job. We can see it through the conflict, the kind of distributing water, food, trying to get to the areas that wasn't it's inaccessible from both conflicted parties. Not to mention the local truces that nobody heard about, where the community used to come together to start mediating between two conflict parties to have temporary truce, either to take out the dead bodies, or to help the people stuck in the area. There was so much success stories from cities that could arrange to be away part of conflict and to dedicate themselves to help displaced people, either in Taiz, the Dhala, or even in Hadramaut. The civil society was so strong and able to work under every shadow. Unfortunately, now we have lots of shadows in Yemen that kind of controlling. They've been working so hard. Under the Houthis, the resistance, and even Al Qaeda, we can see lots of people still can provide and do lots of services, like in Mukalla and other places.
It's destroying
the civil society.
Sorry, just one final thought with you. It's sort of destroying another youth generation. I've often thought about the young people in Palestine, in Gaza, and places where they've grown up with violence and that's all they know. I almost feel like it's going that way in Yemen now as well. We were just looking at pictures of children suffering. This is what they know for 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I would say one of the most devastating thing is there is already a huge generation being destroyed through the wars in Sada, through the neglection of young activists or young people in general, especially in rural areas. There are people now who born and raised in conflict. They know nothing but to fight. Not to mention now, as you just mentioned, now with the war and everything's happened. Unfortunately, recruiting youth become one of the first income source in Yemen. This is most of the youth that now engage in the fight, either because they know nothing but to fight, or it become one of the source of incomes that they have to provide for their families, not to mention the privilege also which came with the idea of fighting with each group, because if you fight with this group, then you would have privilege in sharing lands or taking hijacking cars or whatever other criminal activity that came in. Worse than that, also it started creating a small thug groups who would call themselves with any conflicted party, just to keep getting benefits of this conflict, which unfortunately, as I said, like with no source of income, that would be the best for them to go with.
Of course. Gentlemen, I've only got a couple of minutes left, so a few final questions. Baraa, if I come to you, I mean, another big, broad question, but where do we go from here? And when I say we, I say the international community. There is a UN resolution up there, 2216, which demands an end to the violence. It's like that many other UN resolutions which nothing's been acted on. What should the international community actually be doing now to stop this?
I think without any decisive action against Ali Abdullah Saleh, who spoiled the immunity, he was very blind with revenge. He took the conflict against each and everyone who went to protest or was opposing him during 2011. Without a decisive action or moving him or maybe sanctioning him to the ICC, I think nothing will change. We have the main spoilers, him and his family members and his nephews are still in the country, still running the military and still waging the war. The cause root of the problem is still there. And if that was not removed, I think the Yemen conflict will not be resolved.
Adam, in Dubai, you sort of convinced me earlier or showed me how this is at the heart still a Yemeni problem. And arguably it should have been dealt with and fixed, quote unquote, by the Yemeni people in the first place and the Yemeni politicians. Can that still happen? When there's so much international influence in there, is there still an ability within the country to find a way forward?
I mean, Yemen has traditionally been a country that's demonstrated a tremendous skill for sort of dealing conflict resolution, to put one way. Of course, it's important to remember that regardless of how this war goes, Yemen is wedded to the region. The Gulf states are wedded to Yemen. This is their backyard. So, of course, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, will always be deeply concerned about what's going on in Yemen, and that's completely reasonable, in my opinion. So I think any sort of resolution to this conflict, the Gulf states will somehow have to be involved. They'll have to be buying into the resolution of the conflict. That being said, I mean, in my opinion, unless you really have a genuine cultural shift, not just a change of a few leaders, but a genuine sort of shift in how politics is done in Yemen, you'll just see conflicts repeating in some other form. If you shift out Ali Abdullah Saleh, for example, for another strong man, I think you'll just have a new Ali Abdullah Saleh. So it comes down to the fact that the way politics is being done, both in terms of how it's centralized, how you've seen both the far north and particularly the formerly independent south of the country heavily marginalized. All of these things there's a huge level of issues that have to be solved. And until these issues together are dealt with in a meaningful way, in contrast to how they were dealt with, say, in the national dialogue and over the transitional period, unfortunately, and I hate to be so negative, unfortunately, I feel like Yemen will just continue to see these conflicts emerging again and again in different forms.
Even so, gentlemen, it's been really interesting to actually take a step back with all of you and look at this conflict, as I say, 5 years later. Baraa, Shiban, Adam Baran and Mohammed Al-Shami, thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for joining us once again for this edition of Inside Story. Plenty more for you online at our programme site at aljazeera.com, on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Twitter is at AJ Inside Story. I'm at Kamahl AJE. I'm Kamahl Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. I'll see you again soon.